The book of Revelation describes 7 angels standing before God, each one given a trumpet. Every church showed you that image. Not one of them told you their names, because the names were written 2,300 years before Revelation was composed. In a manuscript, the church councils quietly stopped carrying. Those names still exist. They survived in one language, one tradition, one church, in the highlands of Ethiopia, that looked at the narrowing shelves of Rome and refused. Tonight, we read the names. Silence. Not the silence of an empty room. Not the silence after a sound has stopped and the air is still adjusting. This is older than that. This is the silence that exists in a place where something is already present, where something has been present for longer than the record can measure. 7 figures, standing, not moving, not waiting, standing, the way a stone stands, the way a threshold stands, the way a word carved into granite stands, long after the hand that carved it is no longer anywhere in the world. I want you to hold that image before anything else arrives tonight. 7 figures before a throne, before the oldest written account of that throne that was ever carried forward into human hands. The text is called First Enoch, chapter 20, preserved in full in the Ge'ez language of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, a tradition that never set this book down when others did. There are lines in this manuscript that have not been read aloud in centuries, not because they were difficult, not because they were lost, because the tradition that carried them was a single tradition. One church, one language, one community that looked at the narrowing canon lists coming out of the Western councils and said, "We are not setting this down. Tonight, I am going to read those lines. Not one. 7 names written in a chapter. Most listeners have never truly entered a specific, ordered, deliberately preserved list of the 7 holy angels who stand before God. Not angels in the vague, decorative sense. Not soft figures of later popular imagination. Named beings with specific assignments, governing specific things, recorded and carried roughly 2,300 years before the book of Revelation described 7 angels standing in the same position and did not give a single one of them a name. That distance, that gap between a list of names and a silence where names should be, that is where we are standing tonight. Stay close, watcher. The manuscript is open. The first name is almost visible. There is a moment in the reading of any ancient manuscript when the text stops describing events and begins keeping records. It is a different feeling. A description moves. It carries you somewhere. It has momentum. It has weather. But a record stands still. A record says, this is what was. This is what was named. This is what was counted. This is what someone decided was too important to leave inside the general and not the specific. First Enoch, chapter 20, is a record. It does not tell a story. It does not describe a vision unfolding across a landscape. It opens a list, and before the first name appears, before the manuscript, gives us a single identity. It gives us a title. The title is this: These are the names of the holy angels who watch. Let that sit for a moment before we go further. Not angels who act, not angels who serve, not angels who carry messages or fight battles or announce arrivals. Angels who watch. The word behind that title, in the oldest layers of the tradition, is a word that has a long, complicated, carefully preserved history. In the Aramaic texts, the language in which the earliest recoverable layers of First Enoch were composed, the watching beings are called Irin. Irin, the wakeful ones, the ones who do not sleep, the ones whose eyes do not close over what they have been assigned to see. When the scribes of the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition carried this word forward, they were carrying more than a translation. They were carrying a theology of attention, a theology that says certain beings exist whose entire nature is the refusal of absence. They are present, they are watching, they are named, and chapter 20 of First Enoch gives us those names one by one. Now, I want to be careful here before the first name arrives, because there is something about the structure of this chapter that most readers miss when they move through it too quickly. Chapter 20 is not placed at the beginning of First Enoch. It does not open the book. It does not arrive as an introduction. It arrives after chapters of vision, after Enoch has already traveled, after he has already seen things that the text spent 19 chapters trying to describe. And then, as if the visions themselves required a foundation, as if the journeys needed to be anchored in something more permanent than movement, chapter 20 appears. A list, names, assignments, a record. The placement is deliberate. In the ancient world, in the manuscript traditions of the Second Temple period, a list of names was not administrative paperwork. It was not a directory. It was not an appendix. A list of names was a declaration of ordered reality. It said, the world is not chaos. The world is not ungoverned. The world is not a place where things happen without witness or without structure. The world has named presences within it, named, assigned, watching. And here is the detail that first stopped me. When I read this chapter, slowly, for the first time, the chapter does not say, these are 7 angels who were created for this purpose. It does not say they were appointed last week, or last century, or at some specific moment in sacred history that the text then dates and records. It says, these are their names. This is what they watch over, as if both things, the names and the assignments, had always been true, as if the text is not announcing something new, but recording something that was already the case before the recording began. That is the atmosphere of chapter 20. Not revelation in the dramatic sense, not a sudden opening of something sealed, more like the careful inscription of what the watching world has always looked like from the inside. Now, before the first name, one more thing must be understood about this chapter and about the manuscript tradition that carried it. First, Enoch did not survive the way most ancient texts survive. It did not come down to us through a single line of transmission, one language, one community, one unbroken chain of copying. It survived in pieces, in fragments, in partial manuscripts, across multiple languages and multiple traditions. The Aramaic fragments found at Qumran among the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve portions of the book in what scholars believe is close to the original language of composition. Those fragments are incomplete. They are worn at the edges. Some lines are missing. Some words are unreadable. They give us what survived, the conditions of a cave in the Judean desert, over 2,000 years. But the complete text, the full unbroken chapter, the list with every name, in the order the original intended them to stand, survived somewhere else entirely. It survived in Ge'ez, in the manuscript tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, in scriptoria built on island monasteries, in Lake Tana, in highland communities, whose scribes understood that what they were copying was not curiosity, but canon, the gaze word that the Ethiopian tradition used for this book is Mäṣḥafä Henok, Mäṣḥaf, a written thing worthy of being carried. Henok, Enoch, a written thing worthy of being carried, bearing the name of the man who walked with God and was taken. When the Ethiopian scribes opened this manuscript to chapter 20, they were not opening a disputed text that their church was uncertain about. They were opening scripture. They were opening the record of the watching ones, the record that other traditions had stopped reading aloud, stopped copying into new scrolls, stopped teaching to the next generation, while the Ge'ez hand kept moving across the page. And so the list survived, complete, named in order. Now, the first name is ready to be spoken. But before it is, I want you to feel the weight of what it means for a name to have survived this long in a single tradition, through centuries of narrowing, through councils that made lists of their own, through the long attrition of texts that were no longer regularly read, and to still be here, still in the manuscript, still in the chapter, still in the record of the ones who watch. A name that has survived that long is not merely a label, it is a testimony. It is evidence that something was seen, something was recorded, something was considered important enough by enough careful hands across enough centuries that the silence which swallowed so many other ancient names did not swallow this one. Chapter 20 of First Enoch carries 7 of those testimonies. 7 names, 7 assignments, 7 presences that the watching world has kept recorded since before Revelation's trumpet was ever imagined. The first name governs something. Most listeners do not expect an angel to govern. Not light, not fire, not armies. Something older than all of those. Something the ancient world understood as foundational, and that we have largely stopped thinking about at all. Stay close, watcher. The list is opening now. The first name on the list in First Enoch chapter 20 is a name most people think they already know. Uriel, and they do know it in the way that you know the outline of something without knowing what is inside it. Uriel is familiar from later traditions, from art, from popular angelology, from lists that came after this one, and that borrowed the name while quietly changing what the name meant. So before we carry any later image of Uriel into this chapter, we have to set it down at the door, because what chapter 20 says about Uriel is not what most traditions taught you to expect. The name Uriel in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in the jez that carried it forward, means God is my light, or the light of God, a name built from two roots: light, fire, the burning at the center of a thing, God, the light of God, the fire of God, the one whose name is already a declaration about the source of what illuminates. Now here is the assignment that chapter 20 gives to that name: Uriel, who is over the world and over Tartarus. Hold that, over the world and over Tartarus, both together in the same assignment, under the same name, given to the same presence. In the Greek tradition, Tartarus was the deepest place beneath the earth, not simply the underworld, not simply the place of the dead. The place below that, the place of binding, the place where things that could not be allowed to move freely through the world were held. And in the world of First Enoch, Tartarus carries that weight exactly. The watchers who fell, the ones who abandoned their station, the ones whose story Enoch spent earlier chapters recording with such care, those are the beings that Tartarus holds. And Uriel, the one whose name means the light of God, is placed over both the world above and the place of binding below. That is not a decoration. That is a governance structure. It says the light of God does not only illuminate what is visible and ordered, it also presides over what has been removed from the visible, over what has been sealed away, over the deep place where fallen things are held against their release. Light and containment, illumination and boundary, the world and its underside, both under one name, both under one presence, both under Uriel. That is the first name on the list. And already the list is not what most people thought it would be. The second name, Raphael. Again, a name that seems familiar. A name that has traveled widely enough that most listeners arrive at it carrying images. The healer, the guide, the companion of Tobit on the road, the one who takes the fish and makes the medicine from its organs. Those images are real. They come from real traditions. They belong to Raphael's history in sacred literature. But chapter 20 does not describe a healer walking beside a traveler on a road. Chapter 20 gives Raphael a different assignment entirely. Raphael, who is over the spirits of men, not over illness, not over healing in the physical sense, not over medicine or roads or safe journeys, over the spirits of men. The Gaze manuscript tradition carries this phrase with the weight of something that was understood. To be very specific, in the ancient world, the spirits of men, in the context of First Enoch, refers to the souls of the dead, the departed, the human presences that have left the body and exist in the space between death and whatever comes after death, in the holding place that the text elsewhere describes with geography, with direction, with specific locations for specific kinds of souls. Raphael watches over that, not over the healing of the living, though that tradition came later and carries its own truth, but over the condition of the human spirit after the body is no longer its home. That is the second name, the second assignment, the second presence in the record of the ones who watch. And now, the third name. This is the one I want to slow down for, because this is the name most listeners have never heard spoken in any church, in any sermon, in any popular account of the angelic world that the ancient traditions preserved. Raguel, the name itself, in Hebrew, in the Aramaic root, means friend of God or shepherd of God, a name of closeness, a name of companionship, a name that in another context might have suggested warmth, intimacy, the kind of presence that walks beside rather than stands over. But the assignment that chapter 20 gives to Raguel is not warmth. Raguel, who takes vengeance on the world of light. Read it again. Who takes vengeance on the world of light, not on the world of darkness, not on evil, not on the fallen ones, not on the enemies of what is holy, on the world of light. That phrase stopped me the first time I read it slowly. In this context, because it is so unexpected, so precisely the opposite of what a name like Friend of God seems to promise, that you have to read it twice before the manuscript lets you fully receive it. The world of light, in the cosmology of First Enoch, refers to the luminaries, the sun, the moon, the stars, the appointed lights of heaven, whose courses Enoch spent entire chapters measuring and recording. Those lights are not beyond governance. They are not beyond correction. They are not a law unto themselves, simply because they are luminous. And Raguel, friend of God, is the one assigned to take vengeance when those lights depart from their appointed order, when the luminaries drift, when the courses fail, when the sacred arrangement of the heavens is violated by the very beings meant to maintain it. Raguel answers for that. Now I want to say clearly what makes this assignment so significant in the manuscript tradition, and why it is the name that later popular angelology almost entirely absorbed into silence. The idea that an angel exists whose specific function is to hold the luminaries, the lights of heaven themselves, accountable to their order, is a deeply uncomfortable idea for traditions that have grown accustomed to imagining heaven as purely and seamlessly good, as a place where nothing requires correction, as a realm where accountability belongs only to human beings below and not to any presence above. But the Gehazi manuscript does not offer that comfort. It gives us Raguel, friend of God, assigned to the world of light, watching for drift, appointed to answer when the appointed fail their appointment. The Ethiopian scribes, who copied this chapter by hand in the lamplight of the monastery scriptoria, were not embarrassed by Raguel. They were not tempted to soften his assignment, to move it into the margin, to let it become a footnote instead of a name on the list. They copied it with the same care they gave every other line, because in their tradition, Raguel was not a problem to be explained. He was a witness to be recorded. 3 names now on the list before us: Uriel over the world and Tartarus, Raphael over the spirits of men, Raguel over the world of light. 3 presences, 3 domains, 3 testimonies to the precision with which the ancient text imagined the governance of what exists. And the list is not finished. The 4th name is coming, and it governs something none of the first 3 govern. Not a domain of creation, Not the underworld, not the spirits of the dead, not the lights of heaven, but a people, a specific named people, an assignment that changes the scale of the list entirely, from the cosmic to the particular. Stay close, Watcher. The fourth name is almost here. 3 names behind us now: Uriel, Raphael, Raguel. 3 domains, 3 presences, 3 testimonies that the ancient text preserved with precision, while later traditions carried some of those names forward and quietly left the weight of their assignments somewhere behind. Now the list changes register, not in tone, not in the seriousness with which the manuscript handles what it is recording, but in scale. The first 3 names govern domains of creation, regions of what exists, categories of being that the ancient world understood as foundational to how the cosmos was structured. The world and its underside, the spirits of the departed, the luminaries and their order. The 4th name governs a people, not a region, not a category, not a layer of creation, understood in the abstract. A people, specific, named, known by a history that the rest of the manuscript has been building toward since the first chapter of First Enoch opened its mouth. The 4th name is Michael, and here, as with Uriel, as with Raphael, I want to ask you to set down whatever image of Michael you carried into this chapter, not because those images are false, not because the later traditions that gave Michael a sword, an army, a position at the head of the heavenly host invented something from nothing, but because chapter 20 of First Enoch does not give us that Michael, not yet, not here, not in this chapter, here, in this specific chapter, in this specific list, Michael is given something more intimate and in some ways more surprising than a sword. The name Michael, in Hebrew, in Aramaic, in the gaze that preserved it, means who is like God, not a statement, a question, a name that is itself a question. Who is like God, asked in the direction of anything that might be tempted to answer yes. It is a name of comparison, a name of boundary, a name that says, before you claim greatness, before you claim dominance, before you claim the kind of height that belongs only to one, consider what you are standing next to, and the assignment that chapter 20 gives to that name, Michael, who is over the best part of mankind and over chaos. 2 things again, paired together under one name, as Uriel held the world and Tartarus, as Raphael held the spirits of the departed. Michael holds the best part of mankind and chaos. Now, the best part of mankind. In the gaze manuscript tradition, in the scholarly readings of the Ethiopic text, this phrase points toward the people of Israel, toward the covenant community, toward the specific human lineage through which the ancient text understands sacred history to be moving. This is why the scale shifts here. The first 3 names were over things, over domains, over regions of what exists. The 4th name is over people, over the human community that the text understands as standing closest to the center of what God is doing in history. And alongside that, chaos, the Gez word, behind this pairing, points toward the formless, toward the disordered, toward the condition that exists when the structure the text imagines as proper has not yet arrived or has been broken. Michael holds both, the most ordered and the most disordered, the covenant people and the formless place that exists outside covenant, both under the same name, both under the same watch, both under the presence whose name asks, who is like God, as if the question itself is what keeps both things from collapsing into each other. That is Michael in chapter 20 of First Enoch, not a general, not yet an army, a guardian of the particular, standing at the edge of the formless, holding both without confusion. That is the fourth name. And now, the fifth. This is where the manuscript does something that stops the careful reader, not with drama, not with a sudden rupture in the text, but with a name that does not arrive the same way in every tradition that preserved it. The fifth name on the list in First Enoch, chapter 20, in the Ge'ez manuscript, is Saraqael. Say it slowly, Saraqael. The name, in its Hebrew root, carries the element of God, El, and a root connected to the idea of a prince or a commanding presence, the one who stands at the head of something and speaks with authority over it. God is my prince, or Prince of God, the commanding one of God. The assignment that chapter 20 gives to that name is this: Saraqael, who is set over the spirits who sin, not over sin itself, not over punishment. In the abstract, over the spirits who sin, the beings, the presences, the ones who have a spiritual nature and who have turned that nature in a direction the text understands as departure. In the world of First Enoch, this assignment sits in direct conversation with what the earlier chapters of the book described in such detail: the watchers who fell, the ones who left their appointed station, the ones who brought disorder into the created world. Those are the spirits that Saraqael is set over. And here, at this fifth name, the manuscript tradition offers something that no careful reader of First Enoch should pass through without pausing for, because the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Aramaic fragments of First Enoch found at Qumran in the caves of the Judean desert, do not always give this name as Saraqael. In some of the Qumran fragments, the fifth name appears as Sariel, not Saraqael, not a minor variant of the same letters rearranged slightly, a different form, a form that points toward a related but not identical root. Sariel, meaning God's command, or the moon of God, depending on which ancient root the reader brings to the reading. Now, this matters for a specific reason that goes beyond mere textual curiosity, because when two ancient manuscript traditions, separated by language, separated by geography, separated by centuries of independent copying, give the same position on the same list, a different name, it raises a question that no manuscript can fully answer on its own. Was there always one name here and one tradition? I made an error, or preserved a variant, or received a form that the other tradition did not receive? Or were there two names in circulation, for the same being, both preserved, both carried forward, in different communities that understood themselves to be keeping the same record faithfully and simply received it through different hands. The Ge'ez manuscript gives Saraqael the Aramaic fragments, in some cases gives Uriel. Both traditions understood themselves as carrying the authentic list. That tension does not resolve tonight. It is one of the places where the manuscript record is honest about what it does not fully close, and honest manuscripts that do not pretend to certainties they do not possess, are the ones worth sitting with longest. What is not in doubt is the assignment, whether the name is Saraqael or Sariel. The fifth presence on this list is set over the spirits who sin. The governance is recorded. The assignment is preserved. The watch continues, regardless of which form of the name carried it through the centuries to reach us tonight. 5 names now behind us on the list: Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Saraqael. 5 presences, 5 domains, 5 testimonies to the precision with which this ancient text imagined the watching world. And the 6th name is coming, and it carries the most familiar name of all, a name that nearly every listener in this room tonight has already heard and thought they knew, and will find in chapter 20, saying something so unexpected, so far from the image most traditions handed down, that the familiarity itself becomes the surprise. Stay close, watcher. Gabriel is almost here. Of all the names on this list, Gabriel is the one most listeners arrive at, already holding something. They hold the Annunciation, the angel who appeared to Mary, the angel who stood in the temple before Zechariah, the angel of Luke's Gospel, arriving in light, carrying a message, speaking with the authority of something sent directly from above. They hold Daniel, the figure who came to give Daniel skill and understanding, who touched him while he was exhausted from the vision, who spoke the interpretation of what Daniel could not interpret alone. They hold the messenger, the announcer, the one who carries the word of God across the distance between heaven and a specific human being standing in a specific place, waiting to receive it. That Gabriel is real. That Gabriel belongs to traditions that preserved him faithfully across centuries of reading and retelling. I am not setting that aside. But chapter 20 of First Enoch, the Ge'ez manuscript, the list we have been moving through, name by name, does not give us that Gabriel. Not here, not in this chapter, not in this list. Here, the 6th name on the record of the ones who watch is given a different assignment entirely. Gabriel, who is over paradise, over the serpents, and over the cherubim. 3 things paired together in a single assignment, under a single name, in a single line of the manuscript. Paradise, serpents, cherubim. Now, most listeners who hear that pairing for the first time feel something shift in how they are reading, because paradise and serpents do not belong together in the popular imagination of sacred space. They belong together in one story, one very specific story. The story most sacred traditions in the ancient world treat as foundational, and they belong together. In that story, as opposites, as the garden and the thing that undid the garden, as the place of presence and the creature whose presence there changed everything. But First Enoch, chapter 20, does not treat them as opposites. It places them under the same governance, under the same name, under the same watching presence. Gabriel is over paradise and over the serpents together. That is not an accident. In the manuscript, ancient texts that write with this kind of precision, that build a list, this carefully, that give each name a specific assignment rather than a general description. Do not pair things carelessly. So what does it mean for paradise and serpents to exist under the same governance, watched over by the same presence, kept by the same name? In the cosmology of First Enoch, paradise is not a memory. It is not only the garden that was, the place humanity was removed from at the beginning of recorded history. In the world of this text, paradise continues to exist. It has a location. It has a presence within it. It has a boundary that separates it from what surrounds it. And it has a guardian. The cherubim are part of that guardianship. In the older Genesis tradition, the cherubim placed at the east of the garden with a flaming sword that turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. Chapter 20 does not describe that scene. It does not retell that moment, but it places Gabriel over the cherubim, which means Gabriel stands in relation to the guardianship of the boundary between paradise and what lies outside it. And the serpents are under that same governance, not outside it, not in opposition to it, not placed against Gabriel as his enemy in the list, under him, watched over by him within the domain that his name presides over. Now, this is the detail that the Gaze manuscript tradition preserved without flinching, and that later popular traditions found far more comfortable to set aside. The idea that the serpents of sacred cosmology, the beings associated in the ancient world with what moved along the ground, with what entered sacred space from below, with what the earliest narratives used as the vessel of departure from the garden, are not beyond governance. They are not outside the list. They are not unnamed and ungoverned. In the shadows, beyond the watching order, they are assigned. They are watched. They are under a name, Gabriel's name. What that means, theologically, what it means for the imagination of how the ancient world understood the structure of sacred space. Is that nothing within the territory of paradise? Nothing at the boundary of the garden. Nothing in the long category of what moves through sacred ground is beyond the governance of the watching order. Everything has a name over it. Everything has a presence assigned to it. Everything in the domain of the ancient texts, sacred geography, is watched. The Gaze scribes who copied this line in the lamplight of the island monasteries, in the scriptoria of the Aksumite tradition, were not troubled by Gabriel's assignment. They did not reach for a pen to make a marginal note explaining why paradise and serpents belonged together. under one name. They copied the line. They moved to the next one. They trusted the list to carry its own weight, because in their tradition, the list had always carried it. That is what it means for a manuscript to be living scripture, rather than a disputed artifact on the edge of a shelf. You do not need to explain every pairing. You need to preserve it. You need to carry it forward. You need to hand it to the next generation with the same care you received it, and trust that the weight it carries will be felt by whoever reads it next. And so Gabriel stands in the 6th position on the list, over paradise, over the serpents, over the cherubim, the guardian of the boundary between what was lost and what remained, carrying in a single name the entire geography of departure and presence, the garden that continued even after the gate was closed, and the beings that moved along its border, all of them under one watch. 6 names now behind us on the list: Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Saraqael, Gabriel. 6 presences, 6 domains, 6 testimonies, preserved in the Gez manuscript, carried forward through centuries of careful copying in the one tradition that never decided this list was too strange to keep. And now the list does something the careful reader has to stop for, because after Gabriel, after the 6th name, after the 6th assignment, the manuscripts do not all agree on what comes next. Some traditions end the list here. 6 names, 6 presences, 6 assignments, complete. But one tradition, one manuscript line, one preserved form of this chapter does not stop at 6. It keeps going. It offers a 7th name, a 7th presence, a 7th assignment, a 7th position on the list, whose name appears in some manuscripts and is absent from others, whose assignment is unlike any of the 6 that came before it, and whose existence in the record raises the question this entire night has been building toward. If there is a 7th name, in Revelation described 7 angels standing before God, and named none of them, then what was the 7th name that the silence refused to speak? Stay close, watcher. The 7th name is almost here. There is a kind of gap in a manuscript that is different from all other gaps. Not a gap where the parchment has been torn. Not a gap where the ink has faded beyond recovery. Not a gap where a scribe made an error and a later hand tried to correct it. This is a gap where different communities, different copyists, different traditions that all believed they were preserving the same original, arrived at the same place, in the same text, and did not all write the same thing. That kind of gap is not a wound in the manuscript. It is a witness to something the manuscript itself could not fully resolve. A place where the record shows us not what was forgotten, but what was disputed, preserved differently, handed down through more than one channel, and arrived at the scribal desk in more than one form. Chapter 20 of First Enoch has that kind of gap, and it falls exactly at the 7th position. 6 names carry clearly across the manuscript traditions that preserved this chapter: Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Saraqael, Gabriel, those 6 names, with their assignments, their paired domains, their specific governance of the watching world, appear in the main body of the Gez text with the consistency of a record that knows what it is carrying. But the 7th position, the 7th name, the 7th presence on the list of the holy angels who watch does not travel with the same consistency. In some manuscript traditions, the list ends at 6. Chapter 20 closes. The record is complete. 6 names, 6 assignments, 6 presences, finished. But in other manuscript traditions, in the form of the Gez text that the Ethiopian Orthodox canon carried forward, a 7th name appears. That name is Remiel. Remiel, say it slowly, the way a scribe would have written it, carefully, with the awareness that what the hand records either belongs to the list or it does not, and there is no middle ground in a record this precise. Remiel, now, the name itself carries something that most names on this list do not carry, a genuine ambiguity. At its root, the element El, God, is clear. That is the same foundation every name on this list is built upon. Every name on this list ends or begins with the presence of God inside the word itself. But the first element of Remiel, the root that precedes El, is where the ambiguity lives. If the root is Ram, the name means thunder of God. Thunder, not lightning, not the flash, not the visible rupture of the sky. The sound that comes after, the sound that travels through everything, through walls, through stone, through the body itself. The sound that cannot be looked away from because it does not arrive through the eyes, but through the bones. Thunder of God. But if the root is Racham, the name means mercy of God. Mercy, the most intimate of the divine attributes. In the Hebrew tradition, the word that appears in the same breath as the name of God. In the oldest creedal formulas, the God who is merciful. Rachamim, the tenderness that does not withdraw from what it has made. The compassion that bends toward the broken thing rather than turning away from it. 2 possible meanings. 1 name, thunder of God, or mercy of God, depending on which root the ancient reader brought to the word, depending on which ear heard it, depending on which hand wrote it, and what tradition stood behind that hand. Remiel sounds entirely different. That ambiguity is not a problem to be solved tonight. It is part of the testimony. It tells us that the 7th name, if it belongs on the list, belongs there with a weight the other 6 do not quite carry. The weight of a name that is still asking to be fully understood. Still asking which of its possible truths the reader is prepared to receive. Now, the 7th name does not exist. Only in chapter 20 of First Enoch. It appears somewhere else. Somewhere. Most listeners who know the Enochic tradition have not looked. In the book called 4th Ezra, a text composed roughly in the 1st century of the Common Era, preserved in Latin, and in several other ancient translations, a text that stands in the same broad world of Second Temple Jewish apocalyptic literature that First Enoch inhabited. There is a passage, chapter 4, verse 36, where the soul of Ezra cries out in grief about the suffering of the righteous, about how long the souls of the dead must wait, must remain in their place before the judgment they are promised finally arrives. And in that moment, in that cry of grief, an angel answers. The angel's name in 4th Ezra, chapter 4, verse 36, is Jeremiel. Jeremiel, a variant form of the same name, Remiel, rendered through the Latin transmission of the text, but carrying the same root, the same L, the same presence as the 7th name in First Enoch's list. And the assignment that 4th Ezra gives to Jeremiel is this: he is over the souls of the righteous dead, presiding over the place where they wait, the one who holds the space between death and what comes after, for those whose lives have been counted on the right side of the record. Now, hold that alongside Raphael's assignment from chapter 20, Raphael over the spirits of men, Jeremiel, Remiel over the souls of the righteous dead. Two presences, two distinct assignments, two different aspects of the same vast territory, the condition of the human soul after the body is no longer its home. The manuscript world did not see those as contradictions. It saw them as a more complete map of the same domain, to two names watching over what one name alone could not fully cover. And now the question has been building toward: if the 7th name exists, if Remiel belongs on the list, if the tradition that preserved 7 rather than 6 was preserving something real, then what do we do with Revelation chapter 8 and its 7 angels, its 7 trumpets, its 7 presences standing before God, not one of them given a name, the same position, the same number, the same standing before the throne, and a silence where the names should be? That silence is not emptiness, a silence that precise, a silence that falls over a list. The author of Revelation almost certainly knew is a choice, and choices in ancient texts, choices about what to name and what to leave unnamed, are never accidental. The 7th name is Remiel, thunder of God, or mercy of God, depending on which root you bring to it. Over the souls of the righteous dead, over the space between death and what comes after, present in some manuscripts, absent from others, spoken in 4th Ezra, silent in Revelation. That is the 7th name, and that is the gap this night was always moving toward. Maha, CTA, Family Delta, 6-minute mark, address word, watcher. Before we go further, Watcher, what comes next in this account is the part most listeners find impossible to set aside 2,300 years between a list and a silence, and the question of whether that silence was a choice or a loss or something the author of Revelation carried knowingly into the text and decided the reader was not yet ready to receive. If this kind of night, this kind of old record, read slowly in the right hour, is what you come back to, a quiet subscribe is how you make sure I am here the next time. The night is long. And before we continue, one question I want to leave in the room with you. What part of this account do you most want to understand? Leave it in the comments. If you can, I read them. Now, back to the manuscript. The fragment is waiting. I want you to hold two manuscripts at the same time tonight, not in the same hand, not side by side, on the same table, in the same imagination, one in each direction of your attention, and the distance between them is what this section is entirely about. The first manuscript is the one we have been sitting with all night. First Enoch, chapter 20, the list of 7, the Ge'ez tradition that preserved it when other traditions ceased to carry it. The same way, that manuscript belongs to a world that scholars place roughly in the 3rd to 2nd century before the Common Era. That is not a precise date. Ancient texts do not come with publication records. They come with clues, with language patterns, with historical references that allow scholars to locate them inside a rough range of time, and the rough range for the core material of First Enoch, including this, that contains chapter 20, points toward the 3rd century BCE at its earliest, and the 2nd century BCE as the most commonly accepted window. The second manuscript is the Book of Revelation. Most scholars place its composition in the final decade of the 1st century of the Common Era, roughly the 90s CE, during the reign of the Emperor Domitian, in a world of Roman pressure, of early Christian communities holding on beneath the weight of an empire that had not decided to accommodate them. Between those two windows, the 3rd century BCE and the 90s CE, the distance is approximately 250 to 300 years, at its closest, at its widest, across the full range of possible composition dates. It stretches toward 350 years or more. But the title of this night says 2,300 years, and that number is not wrong. It is measuring a different distance. It is measuring the distance between the oldest material in First Enoch and the present moment, the distance between the scribe who first set down the names in chapter 20 and the listener hearing them spoken aloud for the first time tonight. That is the distance that matters for the soul sitting in this room in this hour. 2,300 years. A name was written 2,300 years ago. It survived. It was carried. It arrived here. And the most widely read apocalyptic text in the history of human literature, written 3 centuries after that name first appeared, looked at the same position, the same standing, before the same throne, the same seven, and went silent. Now, before we ask why Revelation went silent, we have to ask something more foundational. Did the author of Revelation know about the list? This is not a trivial question. It is not a question with a simple yes or a simple no. It is a question that scholars of Second Temple literature, scholars who have spent their professional lives inside the relationship between the apocalyptic texts of that world, have debated with considerable seriousness, and the weight of that debate, the weight of the evidence assembled on both sides, points in one direction more strongly than the other. The world in which Revelation was written, the world of Jewish and early Christian communities in the final decades of the first century, was a world saturated thoroughly, pervasively by Enochic literature. First Enoch was not a fringe text in that world. It was not a curiosity preserved in one corner of one community that most readers would never encounter. It was widely circulated, widely referenced, widely quoted. The letter of Jude in the New Testament itself quotes First Enoch directly, not alludes to it, not borrows its language loosely, quotes it, identifies it by its source, treats it as a text whose authority the reader will recognize. That is the atmosphere of the world in which Revelation was composed, a world where First Enoch was part of the shared imaginative vocabulary of communities trying to understand what God was doing in history, what the heavenly court looked like, what forces governed the cosmic order, what names belonged to the presences that stood closest to the throne in that world. When the author of Revelation wrote the words in chapter 8, verse 2, the seven angels who stand before God, those words did not arrive in a vacuum. They arrived in a world that had a list, a world that knew the names Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Saraqael, Gabriel, and in some traditions, Remiel, a world that had spent centuries copying those names, reading those names, praying near those names, building a theological imagination around those names and what they governed, and into that world, into that list-carrying name, knowing, carefully preserved, apocalyptic imagination, the author of Revelation wrote 7 angels and gave them no names at all. Now hold the specific phrase for a moment, because the phrase in Revelation chapter 8, verse 2 is not accidental language. It is constructed language, deliberate language, language that echoes, that resonates, that reaches back into the tradition. It is writing inside of and does something very specific with what it finds there. The phrase is this: and I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. The 7 angels who stand before God, not 7 angels who were created for this moment, not 7 angels who arrived at the throne at the hour of the vision. The 7 angels who stand before God, present tense, ongoing, already there, already in position, already standing before the throne, as something that has always been the case, the way the list in First Enoch chapter 20 describes them not as beings appointed for a moment, but as beings whose standing before God is simply what they are. A first-century reader who knew First Enoch, who had grown up inside a community that treated that list as part of the inherited vocabulary of how heaven works, would have heard that phrase, the seven angels who stand before God, and known immediately what tradition it was reaching into. They would not have thought, who are these seven? They would have thought, those seven, the ones from the list, the ones whose names I already carry, the ones whose assignments I already know, the ones who watch over the world, over the spirits of men, over the world of light, over the covenant people, over the spirits who sin, over paradise, over the souls of the righteous dead, those seven standing at the trumpet. And yet, Revelation does not say their names. It holds the tradition in one hand and the names in the other, and opens only one. The tradition is opened. The reader is placed inside the recognizable world of the seven who stand. The names are kept, held back, withheld, left in the silence, behind the phrase. That withholding is what the next is entirely about, because it is not an empty withholding. It is not a forgetting. It is not a gap in the author's knowledge. It is a deliberate silence, and deliberate silences in texts this carefully constructed always means something. Stay close, watcher. We are about to stand inside that silence and ask it what it is. Protecting a silence in a text is not the same thing as an absence. In a text, absence says, this was never here. Silence says, this was here, and I chose not to speak it. That distinction matters enormously when we are standing inside Revelation chapter 8, because the author of Revelation was not writing from outside the tradition that carried the seven names. As we established, the world of Revelation's composition was a world where First Enoch circulated, where Enochic language was part of the inherited grammar of how heaven was imagined, where the phrase, the seven angels who stand before God, would have landed in the ear of the reader with the specific weight of a list already known. So the silence is not ignorance. The silence is a decision, and decisions in texts, this carefully constructed texts that every scholar who has worked closely with Revelation will tell you are among the most deliberately crafted in all of ancient literature, do not happen without reason. So what is the reason? What was the silence? Protecting? What did the author of Revelation understand about those names, about that list, about the tradition that had preserved them for centuries before he wrote, that led him to reach into the tradition, invoke the number, invoke the standing before God, invoke the trumpets, and then, at the moment where the names should have appeared, stop. There are three possibilities that serious readers of both texts have placed on the table. I want to give each one its proper weight tonight, not to force a conclusion, but because each one illuminates something about the relationship between these two documents that the careful listener deserves to carry. The first possibility: the author of Revelation withheld the names because the names had already begun their disappearance from common memory by the time he wrote, not because First Enoch had been formally removed from anything, not because a council had declared it off limits, but because texts travel unevenly through communities, because what one group preserves with devotion, another group stops teaching to its children, because the shape of what is commonly known shifts across generations. And by the 90s CE, in the specific communities Revelation was written for, the names may have been receding, familiar to some, unknown to others, present in some libraries, absent from some memories. If that is the case, then Revelation's silence is not a theological statement. It is a pastoral one. The author chose not to name what not every reader would recognize, trusting the tradition that carried the names to continue carrying them while addressing the reader who had not yet received that inheritance. The second possibility, the author of Revelation withheld the names deliberately as a theological act because the names belonged to the old order of heavenly governance, and Revelation was announcing a new moment, a moment in which the specific assignments of the watching order were being superseded by something the old list had never been asked to carry. The trumpets are not a continuation of the old governance. The trumpets are a consummation of it. The seven who stand before God in Revelation are not watching anymore. They are acting. And in that movement, from watching to acting, from governance to judgment, from the ordered maintenance of the world to the final sounding of what ends it, the names may have been set aside, not because they were wrong, but because the function they named had been completed. The list was for the age of watching. The trumpets are for the age of ending, and in the ending, the names are no longer the point. The action is the point. If that is the case, then Revelation's silence is not ignorance and not pastoral care. It is eschatological. The names are retired into the silence of a moment so total that individual identity dissolves into the single movement of completion. The third possibility, the author of Revelation withheld the names because naming them would have imported the entire theological framework of the Enochic tradition, its cosmology, its governance structure, its specific understanding of what the seven were assigned to watch over, into a text that was building a different kind of vision. Not a rejection of the Enochic world, but a deliberate step away from its specificity, a choice to hold the tradition's number, its standing before God, its position in the heavenly court, while releasing the tradition's architecture, its named assignments, its mapped domains, its specific geography of what each presence governed. In other words, Revelation borrowed the seven and left the list behind. It took the image without taking the manual. It took the standing without taking the assignments. It took the trumpets without taking the names. And the result, the theological result, is a set of seven presences who are defined entirely by what they do in the vision, rather than by who they are in the inherited record. Now, none of these three possibilities cancels the others. Ancient authors did not always work from a single motive A silence can be pastoral and eschatological and architecturally deliberate all at once. These are not competing answers. They are overlapping layers of a decision complex enough to have lasted 2,000 years without being fully resolved. But here is what all three have in common, and what this night must not pass over. In all three possibilities, the names are not destroyed, they are not condemned, they are not forbidden, they are not burned out of the tradition by a council with a list of what must not be carried. In all three possibilities, revelation is silent, and the gaze manuscript keeps speaking. That matters. It matters because it means the silence of revelation and the preservation of the Ethiopian Orthodox canon are not two versions of the same story. They are two different responses to the same inheritance. Revelation chose silence. Ethiopia chose custody. And because Ethiopia chose custody, because the gaze hand kept moving across the page, because the scribes of the island monasteries, of Lake Tana, of the highland churches, of the Aksumite tradition, kept copying a chapter that other traditions had stopped centering, the names arrived here, into this night, into this room, into the ear of the listener who has been sitting with this manuscript long enough tonight to feel what the silence in Revelation was sitting next to. The names were not lost when Revelation stayed silent. They were kept somewhere else by different hands, in a different language, under a different sky, but with the same original text as the foundation. And tonight, they are back in the room. All 7 of them, named, assigned, watching, exactly as chapter 20 of First Enoch recorded them 2,300 years before this hour. Stay close, watcher. There is more. The manuscript preserved that Revelation did not speak, and it comes from a third text, older than Revelation, written in Hebrew, preserved outside the Ethiopian canon, but carrying the same 7 under a different name for what they are. That text is almost here. There is a category of ancient text that is harder to locate than the others. Not harder because it is rare, not harder because it was suppressed, or burned, or locked behind a council decision. Harder because it belongs to a tradition of literature most Western readers were never introduced to, a tradition that ran alongside the more familiar texts, parallel to them, drawing from the same deep wells, but moving through a different set of hands, a different set of communities, a different understanding of what sacred reading was for. That tradition is called Hekalat literature. Hekalat, from the Hebrew word for palaces, or halls, or the great chambers of a structure so vast that moving through it requires guidance, requires a companion who knows the layout, requires knowledge of what stands in each chamber and what is required, who wishes to enter. The Hekalat texts are a body of Jewish mystical literature composed roughly between the 3rd and 7th centuries of the Common Era, though drawing on traditions considerably older than their written forms. They are concerned with one central question above all others: what does the divine throne look like from the inside, and how does a human being approach it? Not approach it metaphorically, not approach it through prayer at a safe distance, not approach it through the mediated language of liturgy and temple memory. Approach it directly, move through the chambers, stand before what stands, before the throne, ascend. That is the world of Hekhalot literature, and the most famous of the Hekhalot texts, the one that scholars have studied most closely, the one that carries the most developed vision of the heavenly court and its inhabitants, is called Third Enoch. Third Enoch, also known as Sefer Hekhalot, the Book of the Palaces, a Hebrew text preserved in the Jewish mystical tradition, standing in a different stream from the Gaz First Enoch. We have been reading all night, but reaching back toward the same figure, the same Enoch who walked with God, the same tradition of heavenly witness that First Enoch had established centuries before. And in Third Enoch, in the account of Rabbi Ishmael ascending through the heavens, guided by the great angelic presence, Metatron, the seven appear again. Not called watchers, this time, not called the holy angels who watch, called something that carries a weight entirely its own. ha-Panim. ha-Panim. Two words, both of them doing serious work inside the tradition that produced them. Sar, prince, not prince in the royal lineage sense, not prince as a title of birth, but prince in the ancient Near Eastern sense of the word, the one who stands at the head of something, the commanding presence, the one whose authority over a domain is not given by human appointment, but by the structure of the order itself. Ha-Panim, the face, or the presence. In Hebrew, Panim, the word for face, is also the word for presence, for the forward-facing, for the turned toward, for the direction in which attention moves when something is seen rather than merely sensed from a distance. Ha-Panim, the face of God, the presence of God, the forward-facing aspect of the divine, the place toward which the cherubim turned their faces in the ancient temple, the place described in the oldest priestly formulas as the source of blessing, the face that shines and brings peace. May your face shine upon you and bring you peace. That face, that presence, that forward direction of the divine attention, ha-Panim, means the princes of that presence, the ones who stand at the face of God, not behind the throne, not at a distance from what radiates, not in the outer chambers of the heavenly palace, waiting for assignment, at the face, at the presence, at the place where the divine attention is most directly and most completely turned. That is the position Third Enoch gives to the seven princes, and it is the same position First Enoch, chapter 20, described in different language, standing before God, watching, assigned, present at the center of the heavenly order, closer to the throne than any other named presence in the record. No, the names in Third Enoch's framework are not always identical to the names in First Enoch, chapter 20. The Hekhalot tradition developed its own angelic vocabulary over centuries, its own hierarchies, its own ways of organizing what stood in the heavenly chambers, and that development introduced variations New names, different emphases, different orderings of the same positions, but the core overlap is significant. Michael appears, Gabriel appears, Raphael appears, Uriel appears, the same names that carry a cross. From chapter 20, that survived the distance between Aramaic and Ge'ez, between the Qumran fragments and the Ethiopian canon, carry across again into the Hebrew mystical tradition of Third Enoch. They are still there, still at the face, still in the position closest to the throne, still named and still present in a tradition that was developing on an entirely different branch of the same ancient tree. That convergence is not accidental when three separate traditions, the Aramaic apocalyptic literature of Second Temple Judaism, the Ge'ez canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the Hebrew mystical literature of the Hechalot movement, all arrive independently at the same 7 positions, the same standing before God, the same names. At the center of the list, the convergence is telling us something about the depth of the tradition these names belong to. They are not the invention of one community that spread its particular vision outward. They are the preserved residue of something that multiple communities in multiple languages across multiple centuries kept returning to as the most accurate available account of who stands closest to the face of God. Now, there is one figure in the Third Enoch tradition that opens a new layer of the record for tonight's reading, a presence whose name in the Hechalot literature points toward a function the watching order in First Enoch did not fully name, a function connected to what happens at the innermost threshold, at the place where the divine face is most directly encountered, and where a human being ascending through the palaces would need the most precise guidance of all. That presence is Metatron, not one of the 7. In the original sense, Metatron occupies a different kind of position in Third Enoch, a position so close to the divine throne, so elevated above the other angelic presences, that the rabbinical tradition struggled for centuries with the theological implications of that proximity. But Metatron's presence in the same text as the 7 princes of the divine face, standing in the same chambers, moving through the same palaces, tells us something important about how the Hechalot tradition understood the question. First Enoch, chapter 20, had been asking all along the question of closeness, the question of who stands nearest, who is assigned to the innermost position, who carries the weight of proximity to what no human eye can look at directly and survive. First Enoch, chapter 20, answered that question with a list of names and a set of assignments. Third Enoch answered it with a palace, with chambers, with a literature of ascent and encounter, and the specific danger of approaching what the 7 were assigned to watch. 2 answers, 2 traditions, 2 languages, 2 communities, separated by centuries, both asking the same ancient question: who stands at the face of God, and what are their names? The names have not changed. They have deepened. Stay close, watcher. There is one more layer beneath both of these traditions, older than the Ge'ez, older than the Hebrew mystical texts, preserved in a desert cave for 2,000 years, Before anyone knew, it was there. The Qumran evidence is almost here. In the winter of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd, searching for a lost goat in the cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, threw a stone into a cave he had not intended to enter and heard something break. What broke was a clay jar. What was inside the jar had been sealed inside it for approximately 2,000 years. The scrolls found in the caves of Qumran, in 11 caves over the years that followed that first thrown stone, became the most significant manuscript discovery in the history of biblical scholarship, not because they overturned the tradition, not because they revealed a secret that the tradition had conspired to hide, but because they gave scholars something that had never been available before: manuscript evidence from the period of Second Temple Judaism, from the communities living and copying and preserving texts in the centuries immediately surrounding the composition of the New Testament, evidence that had not passed through the medieval copying chains, had not been filtered through the choices of later ecclesiastical decisions, had not been shaped by the particular priorities of communities that came after, the communities that first wrote it down, raw, worn, fragmentary, incomplete in places where the parchment did not survive. 2,000 years of cave humidity and desert heat, but raw. Among the texts found at Qumran, among the hundreds of manuscripts and thousands of fragments recovered from those 11 caves, were fragments of First Enoch, multiple fragments from multiple caves in Aramaic, the language scholars believe is the closest available to the original compositional language of the Enochic material. These fragments do not give us a complete copy of First Enoch. They give us pieces, portions of chapters, partial lines, edges of columns, where the scroll was once complete and is now worn to almost nothing at the margin. They require the painstaking work of scholars who spend years learning to read what is barely there, to place fragments in relation to each other, to resist the temptation of filling in what the parchment has lost with what the reader hopes to find. That discipline, that refusal to fill gaps with wishes, is one of the things that makes the Qumran evidence so valuable. It tells us only what survives, and what does not survive, it leaves honestly open. Now, among the Qumran fragments of First Enoch, among the Aramaic pieces that have been identified as belonging, that contains chapter 20, scholars find a partial witness to the angel list. Partial, not complete, not the full list, from the first name to the seventh, preserved in clean columns, with every letter legible and certain. Partial, enough to confirm that the list existed in this ancient Aramaic form, enough to show that the names Uriel, Raphael, Michael, Gabriel were present in this tradition, in this language, in this community, in this manuscript world that predates the Gaz tradition by many centuries. But not enough, not complete enough, not preserved enough at the critical edges to settle the question of the seventh. That is the specific and haunting detail of the Qumran evidence for tonight's reading, the fragments that contain portions of the angel list in Aramaic, the oldest available manuscript layer for this material, do not give us a clear, unambiguous, complete preservation of a seventh name. This does not mean the seventh name was absent from the Aramaic tradition. It means the fragments that survive do not settle the question in either direction. The parchment that might have carried the answer is either missing or worn beyond legibility, or was never part of the fragments that survived the 2,000 years between the sealing of the jar and the throne stone that opened it. The gap remains open. Now hold what that means for this night's reading. We have 3 traditions that have been in this room since the beginning of the night. The Aramaic Qumran fragments, the oldest manuscript layer, partial, incomplete at the critical point, leaving the 7th position unresolved. The Ge'ez Ethiopian tradition, complete, carrying 7 names, preserving Remiel in the body of the text, but in a form that some manuscript copies place differently from the other 6, leaving a question about whether Remiel was always in the main record, or arrived there through a secondary layer of preservation. And the Hebrew Hechalot tradition, the world of Third Enoch, the 7 princes of the face, carrying the same core names, developing the same central positions, but arriving at the question from a different angle entirely, and not resolving the 7th position in the same clean way. The Ge'ez text appears to resolve it. 3 traditions, 3 manuscript worlds, 3 languages, 3 communities, separated by geography, by century, by theological emphasis, all arriving at the same 7 positions, and all leaving the 7th name with some degree of openness. That convergence of openness is itself a form of testimony. It says the 7 positions are real. The tradition that places 7 beings before the divine throne is ancient, multiply attested, carried across independent streams of preservation. But the 7th name, the last position, the one closest perhaps to the silence that Revelation chose, has always been the one that the record holds with the least complete certainty. Not because it was invented, not because it was added late by a scribe who needed to reach a number, but because something about the 7th position, about what it governs, about what it means to stand at the edge of the list and face whatever comes after the 6th, has always resisted the kind of clean preservation the other 6 received. The 7th position is where the manuscripts grow quieter, and quiet manuscripts, manuscripts that carry less rather than more, at a specific place, are sometimes the most honest manuscripts of all. They are telling us, not with silence, but with incompleteness, that what stands at the 7th position is real and named and assigned, and still not fully received by any single tradition that tried to carry it. Nah. Silence. Break. 50% mark. Theme. The untranslated word, preserved but undefined. Poreji. Here the record does something I want to name before we continue, in one form of the gaze manuscript, Remiel's name appears not in the body of the chapter, but in the margin, written there by a scribe who clearly felt it could not be left out, and left no explanation for why it was placed outside the main text rather than within it. That margin note has no commentary beside it, no reason given, no cross-reference offered, just the name placed at the edge, preserved and unexplained. I have sat with that a long time. I am not going to pretend I understand it. Now, back to the manuscript. I want you to imagine a specific room, not a large room, not a grand hall with high ceilings and the kind of architecture that announces itself from a distance. A small room, stone walls, the particular cold that stone holds. Even in a warm climate, the cold that comes not from the air outside, but from the weight of the material itself, from centuries of stone that has absorbed everything around it and released nothing. A lamp, one lamp, set close to the work, not for atmosphere, not for the beauty of low light in an ancient space, for the work, because the letters are small and the reed must move carefully, and the hand that holds the reed has been trained over years to make each character with a consistency that the next generation will be able to read without confusion. And confusion in a manuscript is not merely inconvenient, it is a form of loss. That room is the Gaius Scriptorium. It existed in many forms across many centuries in the island monasteries of Lake Tana, where the water surrounds the stone and the distance from the mainland creates the kind of silence that serious work requires in the highland churches of the Aksumite tradition, where the altitude and the cold and the particular quality of highland light shaped the atmosphere of everything that was written there in the scriptoria of monasteries whose names are not famous in the Western world. Däbrä Bizan, Däbrä Damo, Gunda Gunde, places where the tradition of careful copying ran continuously for centuries without interruption, without the kind of break that would have required a later generation to reconstruct what an earlier generation had preserved. In those rooms, in those specific places, under those specific lamps, someone copied chapter 20 of First Enoch, not once, many times, over many centuries, by many hands, in the same language, as the classical Ethiopic that had become the liturgical tongue of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the language in which scripture was read aloud, prayed near, memorized, carried forward into the bodies of a community that treated it not as an artifact, but as living text. Now, I want to say something carefully about what it means for a text to be living rather than merely preserved. A preserved text can sit on a shelf. It can exist in a single manuscript, in a single archive, known to scholars, catalogued, studied, never read aloud, never heard by anyone who did not come specifically looking for it. That is preservation. It keeps the text from disappearing. It keeps the letters legible. It keeps the record intact. but it does not keep the text alive. A living text is something different entirely. A living text is read near prayer. It is copied because the community that copies it believes it belongs to what they are, not only to what they study. It is handed to the next generation, not as a curiosity they might eventually find useful, but as part of the inheritance. They cannot be themselves without. That is what the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition did with First Enoch. It did not treat it as a text that needed to be justified to outsiders. It did not carry it apologetically with careful footnotes explaining why a book not in other canons was in theirs. It carried it as scripture, as Mäṣḥafä Henok, the written thing worthy of being carried, bearing the name of Enoch and belonging to the canon, not because a later council approved it after sufficient debate, but because it had always been there, always been part of what the tradition received, always been among the texts that shaped how this community understood the structure of heaven, the names of the watching order, the governance of what exists. Now, how did this begin? How did a text composed in Aramaic in the world of Second Temple Judaism, preserved in fragments in a Judean desert cave, arrive in Ethiopia, in Ge'ez, in the canon of a Christian church that did not exist until the 4th century of the Common Era? That question leads us to a name most Western readers have not spent much time with: Frumentius. Frumentius of Tyre, a young man from the Phoenician city of Tyre who found himself in the Aksumite Empire in the early 4th century through a combination of shipwreck, captivity, and the particular kind of historical accident that tends to precede something significant. He rose within the Aksumite court. He earned the trust of the royal household. He used that position to facilitate the growth of Christian communities within the empire. And when he eventually sought ordination, he traveled to Alexandria to Athanasius himself, the bishop of Alexandria, and returned to Aksum as its first bishop, carrying with him the theological inheritance of Alexandrian Christianity, including its relationship to the texts that the Alexandrian tradition had received, including a canon that was broader in some respects than what the later Latin councils would eventually standardize. The Aksumite Empire that received Christianity through Frumentius was already one of the most powerful civilizations in the world, with a literate culture, a tradition of inscription, the great obelisks of Aksum standing as testimony to a society that understood the preservation of language as a form of power and memory. Into that culture, into that already serious relationship with the written word, Christianity arrived with its texts, and among those texts, carried within the Alexandrian inheritance, was First Enoch. The Ethiopian church did not discover First Enoch as a novelty. It received it as part of what Christianity was, in the form in which Christianity arrived at its door, and because it received it that way, as inheritance rather than discovery, it never had reason to treat it as something requiring special justification. It was simply part of the canon, Mäṣḥafä Henok, part of the 81 books of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo scripture, not an appendix, not a supplement, not a disputed text, carried in brackets with a warning label, scripture. And so, the 7 names of chapter 20, the 7 holy angels who watch: Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Saraqael, Gabriel, and in the tradition that carried 7 rather than 6, Remiel, were not preserved, the way the Qumran fragments were preserved, sealed in a jar, waiting in a cave, unknown for 2,000 years, until a stone was thrown through the right opening. They were preserved, the way living things are preserved, by being used, by being read aloud, by being copied again and again, not because a librarian decided they were historically significant, but because a community decided they were spiritually necessary, by being carried in the mouths of people who prayed near them, who taught their children what the names meant, who built a liturgical imagination in which 7 presences before the divine throne were not anonymous, were not the vague, decorative attendants of a generalized heaven, but named, assigned, watching, specifically and deliberately, present at the face of God. That is what living preservation looks like, and that is what the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition gave to these 7 names, when many other traditions had already let the list grow quiet. Stay close, watcher. The names survived, because a tradition kept them. But what exactly did those names mean to the scribes who copied them, to the community that prayed near them, to the tradition that refused to set them down? That question belongs to the next. We have come far enough tonight to be able to return to the beginning with different ears. At the start of this night, the 7 were a number, a count, a theological claim in an ancient text that most of the world had not spent time with. 7 angels standing before God. That was the shape of the opening. But now, 7 is not a number anymore. It is a list. It is 7 specific presences, 7 names, 7 assignments, 7 distinct functions in the governance of what exists. And the difference between a number and a list is not merely grammatical. It is the difference between a claim and a testimony. A claim says, there are 7. A testimony says, here are their names. Here is what each one governs. Here is the specific way each one is present in the structure of what God made and what God watches over. First Enoch, chapter 20, chose testimony. And that choice, the choice of specificity over generality, the choice of naming over gesturing, the choice of assignment over vague presence, is one of the most important things about this chapter that most listeners have never been given space to sit with. In the ancient Near Eastern world, in the world from which the Enochic tradition drew, in the Hebrew, the Aramaic, the older Semitic cultures that surrounded and shaped the imagination of the Second Temple period, a name was not what modern culture tends to understand it as. In the modern imagination, a name is a label. It distinguishes one thing from another thing. It allows communication to proceed without confusion. It is useful, practical, necessary for organization, but ultimately arbitrary. You could have been called something else. The thing you are would not have changed. The ancient world did not think this way. In the ancient world, in the world of the texts we have been reading tonight, a name was not a label placed over a reality that existed independently of it. A name was a disclosure of what a thing was. It named the function. It named the nature. It named the domain. It named the responsibility. To know the name was to know something real about what stood behind it. This is why the naming of creation in Genesis carries such theological weight when Adam names the creatures. He is not labeling them for organizational convenience. He is participating in the act of disclosure, of reading what each creature is, of receiving its identity and giving it a form in language that corresponds to what it actually is. And this is why the refusal to give a name, or the withholding of a name, in the ancient world was never trivial. When Jacob wrestled with the figure at the ford and asked for its name, and was refused, the refusal was not rudeness. It was the withholding of a specific kind of access. To know the name would have been to know the nature. To know the nature would have been to hold something that the figure was not yet prepared to give. Names in the ancient world carried power, not in the magical sense, not in the sense of a secret formula that commands obedience, but in the ontological sense, in the sense that knowing a name meant knowing something true about what existed. Now bring that into chapter 20 of First Enoch. The list is not merely 7 names organized for convenience. The list is 7 disclosures, 7 statements about what exists at the face of God, 7 truths about the nature of the beings assigned to watch over the created order, 7 pieces of a map of the governance structure of everything the ancient text understood to be real. Uriel's name discloses that light, the light of God, is present at the boundary between the world and what is sealed beneath it. Raphael's name discloses that healing, or the restoration of what has been broken, is present in the governance of the human spirit after the body is gone. Raguel's name discloses that friendship with God, intimate closeness, is the nature of the presence assigned to watch the world of light for its failures. Michael's name discloses that the question, who is like God, is the nature of the presence standing between the covenant people and the formless. Saraqael's name discloses that the commanding authority of God, the Prince of God, is present over the spirits who sin, over the ones who have turned their spiritual nature in the wrong direction. Gabriel's name discloses that God's strength, the root Gavri, the strong one of God, is the nature of the presence standing over paradise, over the boundary of what was lost, over the beings that move along its border. And Remiel, if Remiel belongs on the list, discloses either the thunder of God or the mercy of God as the nature of the presence standing over the souls of the righteous dead, over the space between death and what comes after, over the place where the most final and tender question of human existence waits for its answer. 7 names 7 disclosures, 7 truths about what watches over the created order from the position closest to the throne. Now consider what Revelation chose to give instead. 7 angels. No names, no disclosures, no map of what each one governs. 7 presences, defined entirely by what they do in the vision, by the trumpet each one receives, by the judgment each one initiates, and by nothing else. That is not a lesser choice. It is a different choice. It is a choice that serves a different purpose. Revelation is not building a map of the watching order. Revelation is building a vision of the ending of the watching order. The governance has been completed. The assignments are being fulfilled in their final form. The watching is becoming acting. The maintenance is becoming consummation. In that moment, in the vision of the end, the names may indeed belong to the silence, not because they were lost, but because what they named is being fulfilled beyond the need for further naming. But First Enoch, chapter 20, does not stand at the end. It stands in the middle of things, in the age of watching, in the long governance of the created order, before the trumpets sound, in the time when the names still matter, because what they disclose is still the active reality of how the world is held together. In that time, in that position, the names are not optional. They are the testimony, and the Ge'ez tradition understood that. The scribes, in the lamplight of the highland monasteries, copied 7 names, because in the age they were living in, the age before the trumpet, the age of the ongoing watch, the names were still disclosing something true about the structure of what existed above them. They were not preserving a historical curiosity. They were maintaining a theological record of the active governance of the world. 7 presences, 7 names, 7 truths about what stands at the face of God and what it is assigned to watch over in the long age before the silence of the trumpets replaces the names with the sound of what comes after them. The list is complete now. The record has been read. The names have been spoken, and the room is beginning to change. Not dramatically, not suddenly, the way a scriptorium changes at the end of a long night of copying, when the lamp has burned most of its oil, when the reed has been set down for the last time, when the hand has done what it came to do, and the room becomes quieter than it was before the work began. Stay close, watcher. The manuscript is nearly finished for tonight. What remains is not more to learn, but somewhere to rest what has already been received. The last reed has been set down for the night. The lamp in the scriptorium has reached the last of its oil. The manuscript is closed, not finished. A manuscript like this is never finished, but closed for tonight, set aside with the kind of care that says, I will return to this. There is more here than one night can fully receive. But for now, the work is done. And what remains is not more reading. What remains is the ancient place that held these names long before the manuscript was written, long before the first scribe pressed reed to parchment. This place existed, and it is still here. Aksum, in the highlands of what is now northern Ethiopia, at an altitude where the air is thinner than the lungs of the lowland world. Expect where the cold at midnight comes not as discomfort, but as clarity, as a sharpening of what the senses can receive, as the particular gift of high places that have always understood that nearness to sky changes something in the quality of attention. The obelisk field at Axum does not announce itself. It does not require dramatic approach. It does not ask the visitor to prepare. It simply stands there, the way the seven simply stood before God in the manuscript we have been reading all night, without ceremony, without announcement, without the need for an explanation of why they were there. They were there because that was what they were. The obelisks of Axum are carved from single pieces of granite, not assembled, not built from smaller stones, mortared together, the way later traditions built their monuments, cut from the earth as one piece, shaped, tapered, inscribed, and then raised to stand the way something stands that was always meant to stand, the way a presence stands that does not require permission from the air around it to remain upright. At midnight, the obelisk field has a quality that the daylight hours do not give it. In the daylight, a visitor sees the carvings, the false windows cut into the stone faces, the interlocking patterns of the Axumite aesthetic, the careful geometry of a civilization that understood that stone could be made to speak if the right hand knew how to ask it. But at midnight, the carvings recede. They are still there. The hands that carved them did not stop their work because the light changed. The inscriptions did not retreat into the granite when the sun went down. But at midnight, they are not what you see first. What you see first at midnight in the obelisk field is the shape, the silhouette of stone against sky, the particular darkness of granite against the particular darkness of highland sky at an altitude where the stars press closer than they do, at sea level where the sky does not recede into vague distance, but arrives, stays, remains overhead, with the presence of something that is actively and specifically there. The obelisks and the stars belong to each other at midnight, not metaphorically. The stone points upward because the civilization that raised it understood that what was above was not separate from what was below, that the ordering of the heavens and the ordering of the earth were part of the same governance, the same watching, the same careful arrangement of what exists by a presence that had assigned names to the ones who stood closest to it. The names we read tonight in the manuscript, they are here too, not written on the obelisks, not carved into the face of the stone in any inscription a scholar has yet found, but present the way a name is present in a room even when no one is speaking it, the way Uriel is present in every boundary between light and what contains it, the way Raphael is present in every place where a human spirit has been set down by a body that could no longer carry it, the way Raguel is present in the sky itself, in the movement of the stars above the obelisks, watching for drift, watching for the moment when the appointed lights begin to depart from their appointed courses. Stand in the obelisk field at midnight long enough, and the names stop being names. They become qualities of what is around you. Uriel in the edge, between the lit stone and the dark sky. Michael in the cold that stands between the ordered field and the vast, unordered darkness beyond its boundary. Gabriel in the threshold itself, the place where the ground of the ancient city meets the open highland, the boundary between what was enclosed and what remains open and ungoverned. Beyond the last obelisk, the field is quiet now. It has been quiet for a long time. The civilization that raised these stones passed through its own history, its rise, its greatness, its conversion, its preservation of texts that other traditions were releasing, its slow passage into the condition all civilizations eventually enter, the condition of having become something different from what they were, while still standing in the same ground, while still being surrounded by the same stones they raised when they were at their fullest. But the obelisks did not change with this civilization. They were granite when the empire was at its height. They are granite now. The same stone, the same weight, the same upward reach into the same sky, changed only by the particular quality of having stood for a very long time in the same place, which is not a diminishment. It is a deepening. A stone that has stood for 1,500 years in the same field has received 1,500 winters, 1,500 rainy seasons, 1,500 midnight skies, exactly like this one. It has been present for all of them, without being asked, without being required to justify its presence, without being required to explain what it was doing there when the people who raised it were no longer there to explain. It simply stood the way the seven simply stood before God in the manuscript, the way the watching order simply watches without requiring the world it watches to acknowledge that it is being watched, without requiring the sleeping listener to stay awake, to make the watching real. The field is still now. The wind crosses it from the north, from the direction of the highland plateau, carrying the particular cold of high-altitude air in the hour before dawn. Not unpleasant, not the cold that contracts and makes the body argue with itself about whether to stay. The cold that clarifies, the cold that says, you are here. This is real. The stone is real. The sky is real. The names you have been carrying all night are real. Rest now. The field will hold you the way it has held everything that came to stand in it, without condition, without requirement, without asking anything in return for the shelter of its stillness. Simply here, simply standing, simply present, the way the seven are simply present at the face of God, in the manuscript, in the tradition, in the ancient record that this night has been reading slowly toward its rest. Come closer to the stone, not dramatically, not with urgency, the way you move towards something at the end of a long night, when there is no longer any need to hurry, when everything that needed to be done has already been done, when what remains is simply being present to what is here, Come closer. The surface of the granite is not smooth. It was never meant to be smooth. Smoothness is for things that want to be passed over easily. Surfaces that offer no resistance, no texture, no record of what shaped them. Granite is not like that. Granite remembers everything that happened to it. The slow pressure of the earth that formed it, the heat that crystallized it into what it became, the hands that worked it, the Aksumite craftsmen who understood that cutting granite was not an act of conquest over the stone, but a conversation with it, a long, patient exchange between human intention and the particular resistance of a material that has been forming since before human intention existed. Run your hand across the surface. In the imagination, not in reality. You are not there. The obelisk field is in northern Ethiopia, and you are here, wherever here is for you tonight. But in the imagination, in the place where this night has been taking you, run your hand across the stone. Feel the grain of it, the slight roughness, where the tool moved across the surface 15 centuries ago and left the mark of its passing. The deeper cuts where the inscription begins, where the carving was deliberate, where the craftsman moved slowly and with intention rather than quickly and with force. The places where the granite pushed back, where the natural grain of the stone deflected the tool slightly, and the line that was meant to be perfectly straight has a barely perceptible curve to it, a curve that no one would notice unless they were standing this close, with this much time and this much willingness to receive what the stone actually is, rather than what they imagined it would be. The inscriptions on the obelisks of Aksum are Ge'ez, some of them, the ones from the Christian period, the ones carved after Frumentius, and the Aksumite conversion, after the tradition that would preserve First Enoch had already taken root in this civilization, after the community that would spend centuries copying the 7 names of chapter 20 had already formed around the practice of treating sacred language as something worth pressing into permanent material. Gaze on stone, gaze on parchment, the same language in 2 different materials, one meant to be read once and replaced, one meant to be read as long as the stone stands, both carrying the same conviction that the language of sacred memory is worth the effort of preservation. And at midnight, in the starlight, the inscriptions on the stone face do something that the same inscriptions in a manuscript do not do. They cast shadow. The carved lines cut into the surface of the stone are deeper than the surface, and the light that falls across them from the stars above, that pale, constant, ancient light falls into the cuts and does not reach the bottom of them, and so the letters of the inscription are defined not by the light that hits them, but by the shadow that lives inside them. Dark letters on a darker stone, visible only because the darkness inside the cut is slightly deeper than the darkness outside it, writing preserved by its own shadow. Think about that for a moment. The inscription is readable at midnight, not because light illuminates it, but because the depth of the carving creates a darkness within darkness that the eye can distinguish if it is patient enough, if it stands still enough, if it gives up the expectation of easy reading and receives instead the slower truth of what the stone actually offers. Patience. That is what the obelisk field asks of the visitor at midnight. Not intelligence, not expertise, not the ability to translate every line of the ancient inscription. Patience. The willingness to stand still long enough for the stone to give you what it has. And this is also what the manuscript asked of us tonight. Not speed, not cleverness, not the ability to extract the maximum amount of information in the minimum amount of time. Patience, the willingness to read slowly, to hold the names one at a time, to let the assignments land at the pace they were written, which was a pace that assumed the reader had time, had the whole night, if necessary, had nothing more important than this, the inscription on the stone face before you in the midnight field. You do not need to read it to receive what it offers. You only need to stand near it long enough to feel that something was put here deliberately, that the hands that moved across this surface were not random, not accidental, not indifferent to what they were making. They believed what they were making would last, and they were right. The stars above the field are moving the way stars always move, the way the astronomical book of First Enoch described them moving through appointed gates, along appointed courses, in the pattern that Uriel showed to Enoch, in the vision, the pattern that was revealed, so that the righteous would know that the heavens did not improvise, that the lights above moved as they were, assigned to move, that the sky tonight, over the obelisk field, over the granite, and its inscriptions, over the highland plateau, and its cold clarifying air, is the same sky that has been moving in the same courses since before the first obelisk was raised in this field. The watching order did not change. When the empire changed, the names did not become less true. When the civilization that preserved them became something different from what it was, Uriel still at the boundary, Raphael still over the spirits, Raguel still watching the lights, Michael still at the edge of the covenant people, Saraqael still over the spirits who sin, Gabriel still at the threshold of paradise, and Remiel, or the mercy of God, or the thunder of God, still over the space where the righteous dead wait for the answer to the most final of questions, still watching, still standing, still present at the face of God, as they were when the manuscript first named them, as they will be when every manuscript has returned to the dust it was made from. The stone is cold under the hand now, cold and still and very old, and that is enough for this moment. Cold, still, old, real. Here, the field has grown still now. The wind from the north that was crossing it earlier, that cold, clarifying wind off the highland plateau, has softened, not stopped entirely, Wind at this altitude does not fully stop before dawn, but softened the way everything softens in the hour before the sky begins to change color at its eastern edge. The hour that is neither night nor morning, the hour that belongs to neither and to both. The obelisks are still here. They will be here when the sky changes. They will be here when the sun clears the highland edge and the shadows of the field shift from pointing west to pointing east. They will be here tomorrow night when this same sky returns above them and the stars resume their courses exactly as they left them, because the stars do not leave their courses. The appointed movement does not pause for the daylight that temporarily makes it invisible. It continues, always. And the seven who stand before God, the seven whose names the manuscript carried through 2,300 years to reach this night. They are not in the obelisk field. I want to be clear about that. This is not a claim that the watching order lives in granite that Uriel inhabits, a stone in northern Ethiopia that Raphael presides from the summit of a carved obelisk over a highland city that has been sleeping for a long time. That is not what this is. What this is simpler than that, and in some ways more available. The seven are present the way truth is present, in a place that has long been in relationship with truth, the way a room where prayer has happened for centuries holds something in its walls that a room where nothing of importance has ever occurred does not hold. Not magic, not enchantment, not a force that bends the physical laws of the place toward supernatural effect. Simply accumulated presence, the residue of generations of people who stood in a place and directed their attention toward what they believed was above them and real and watching. This field is one of those places. The civilization that raised these stones believed that heaven had order, that the order had names, that the names could be preserved and passed on, that what watched from above was not indifferent to what stood below. That belief shaped the way they cut the stone, the way they raised it, the way they pointed it toward the sky. It was reaching for the way they inscribed it in a language that their church would carry forward long after the empire had become something else, and that shaped belief, that accumulated attention, that long history of a civilization, and then a church, and then a scribal tradition, and then a canon, all directing their faces toward the same. Seven presences. That is what you feel in the field at this hour, not the presences themselves, not in any literal sense. That would require a different kind of claim than this night is making, but the shape left behind by centuries of attention directed their way. The impression in the stone, not carved, but worn. The slow wearing that comes not from deliberate inscription, but from repeated presence, from the accumulated passage of people and weather and time across a surface that simply received them. All that impression is what remains now in the quiet of the field. Seven presences, not standing dramatically against the sky, the way they might stand in a painting, haloed and vast, and arranged for viewing. dissolved into the place, part of the cold air, part of the shadow, inside the carved letters, part of the particular quality of starlight. At this altitude, that pressing close starlight that the highland sky offers, to those who stay awake long enough to receive it, Uriel in the edge, between lit stone and unlighted sky, neither, the boundary itself, Raphael in the quality of stillness that descends on a field in the hour before dawn, that particular stillness that feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of rest, the rest that comes after the spirit has set down what it was carrying and found that the ground will hold it. Raguel, in the movement of stars above the obelisks, still in their courses, still faithful to the appointed pattern, still refusing to drift from what they were assigned to be, the watching that never tires, the attention that does not wander, the governance that holds even when nothing below is watching back. Michael, in the cold, that stands at the edge of the field, at the place where the ordered ground of the ancient city gives way to the open highland, unnamed, unordered, vast, and held by the presence that stands between the particular and the formless, that keeps the boundary without closing, the openness beyond it. Saraqael, somewhere in the darkness, between the obelisks, in the spaces the stones do not fill, in the negative space of the field, watching what moves there, what passes through the unwatched places, what travels in the dark between the standing things and is not beyond governance, simply because it prefers the shadow. Gabriel, at the threshold, at the place where this field ends, and something else begins, the guardian of the boundary between what was enclosed and what remains, open, still at the gate, still watching what comes and what goes, still present at the edge of what is kept and what is released, and Remiel, or the mercy of God, or the thunder of God, depending on which route the night has given you, present in the quality of this particular hour, in the space between the end of wakefulness and the beginning of what comes after, in the threshold that every soul crosses at least once, and that the righteous cross toward a presence that has been watching for them, waiting without impatience, without the diminishment of long waiting, present, assigned, ready. The field is quiet now. The seven have dissolved into it, the way truth dissolves, into a place that has been carrying it long enough, not disappearing, not leaving, simply no longer requiring the voice to be present, simply here, the way the watching order is always simply here, whether spoken of or not, whether named or not, whether the manuscript is open or closed. Rest now. The field holds you. The stone is here. The sky is here. The names are here. And you do not need to hold them. They were holding long before you arrived tonight. They will hold long after. The voice grows quiet. I am going to stop explaining now. There is nothing left that needs explaining. The manuscript has been read. The names have been spoken. The field is here. That is enough. I want to say one thing before I grow quiet, and it is not a new argument. It is not another fragment. It is not a detail. I kept back until the end because the end seemed like the right place for it. It is simply this: the manuscript that carried these names through 2,300 years did not survive because it was important to scholars. It survived because it was important to people. Real people. People who woke before dawn in cold stone rooms, who lit a lamp in the dark, who sat down before parchment, who picked up a reed and copied, not because someone told them to that day, because they belonged to a tradition that had always done this, and the tradition had always done this because the people inside it understood that what they were copying was not theirs to let go. That is all. That is the whole of what I wanted to say. Now I am going to be quieter. The field is still here. The obelisks are still standing. The stars are still in their courses. The granite is still cold under the hand that is no longer reaching for it. And somewhere in a monastery, on an island in Lake Tana, or in a highland church in northern Ethiopia, or in a library that holds Ge'ez manuscripts under glass and controlled air, the manuscript is still there. Chapter 20 is still there. The 7 names are still there, in the order they were always in the language that carried them, waiting the way manuscripts wait, without impatience, without the fear of being forgotten, because a manuscript that has survived 2,300 years has already outlasted the impatience of every reader. Whoever picked it up in a hurry. It is not in a hurry. It was not in a hurry. When the first scribe sat down with it, he was not in a hurry. In the cave at Qumran, where the Aramaic fragments waited in their sealed jar, it was not in a hurry. In the scriptorium, where the Ge'ez hand moved slowly across the page, it is not in a hurry now. And you do not need to be in a hurry either. Not tonight, not in this hour, not in this particular and unrepeatable moment of your particular and unrepeatable life, when you chose to spend the night in the company of a manuscript that most of the world has never sat with, and 7 names that most of the world has never heard spoken, slowly, one by one, with the weight they were written to carry. You chose that tonight, and the manuscript received you the way manuscripts receive every reader who comes to them with enough patience to stay. The field is quiet. The witness is almost gone now. Not gone entirely, still here. The way the impression in the stone is still here. The way the shadow inside the carved letter is still here. The way the names are still here. Not requiring the voice to remain present, not requiring anything from this moment except the willingness to let it be what it is. Quiet, cold stone, moving stars, 7 presences at the face of God. 1 manuscript still carrying their names. 1 tradition that never set it down. 1 night, this night, in which the names were spoken again. That is what happened here. That is what this was. Nothing more needs to be said. and nothing more will be. The witness is going quiet now, not away, just quiet. The way the reed goes quiet when it is set down beside the lamp. The way the lamp goes quiet when its oil has given everything it had to give. The way the stone was always quiet before and after every word that was ever carved into it or spoken beside it. Quiet, still, here, the plateau, the stone, the sky, still, the wind across the granite. Not a sound exactly, more like the memory of a sound, the trace a sound leaves in the air, after the air has already moved on. Still, the stars have moved since this night began, slightly, the way stars move when no one is watching, not dramatically, not in great arcs that announce the passage of time, but in the slow, faithful, appointed drift of presences that are simply doing what they were assigned to do, whether or not anyone below them is awake to notice. They do not need to be noticed to continue. They do not need to be named to keep their courses. They do not need anything from the sleeping world below them. They simply continue. The obelisks have not moved. They will not move tonight. They will not move tomorrow night. And they have not moved in 15 centuries, and they carry that stillness, the way a stone carries everything that has ever happened near it, quietly, without complaint, without requiring acknowledgement, without needing the world to understand what it means to have stood in the same field, under the same sky, for 1,500 years. It means nothing that requires explaining. It simply is. The field is breathing now, not metaphorically. The grass at the edge of the carved stone, the thin highland grass that grows in the places the granite has not claimed entirely, moves slightly in the almost wind, the wind that has softened to nearly nothing, the wind that is now more an inclination than a force, and the movement of the grass is the field breathing, in, out, slow, unhurried. The way you're breathing is slow and unhurried now, or close to it, or becoming it. If it is not already, there is nothing you need to do with your breathing. It knows what it is doing. It has always known, even when you forgot to pay attention to it, even when the day demanded everything except the quiet fact of breath. It continued. The way the stars continue, the way the stone continues, the way the watching order continues, named or unnamed, spoken of or silent, manuscript open or manuscript closed. The highland air is cool against the face, not cold enough to require resistance, cool enough to remind the body that it is here, that here is real, that the ground beneath the body is solid, the way the granite of the obelisk field is solid, the way the ancient record is solid, the way the names that were written down 2,300 years ago and carried forward by careful hands through careful centuries are solid, still there, still named, still watching. The body knows how to rest. It has always known. The mind sometimes forgets to let it. But tonight, the mind has been somewhere far from its usual concerns. Tonight the mind was in a field, in northern Ethiopia, standing near a stone that has been standing longer than most traditions that now call themselves ancient. Tonight, the mind carried 7 names through the hours until the names became quieter than thought, lighter than worry, older than the particular anxieties this day brought to the threshold of this night. The names are still here. They do not leave. When the voice does, they were here before the voice arrived. They will be here long after, and they require nothing from the sleeping body, nothing from the quieting mind, nothing from the breath that is slowing now toward something that is not quite wakefulness, and not quite the other thing, but the soft passage between them. That passage the body makes without asking permission, without requiring instruction, without needing anything at all, except to be left alone, to do what it has always known how to do. The plateau, the stone, the sky, the names, the silence that was here before any of them were named and will be here after. Rest now. The field is still. The watching order is in its place. Everything that needed to be held tonight is being held by presences older than your holding, stronger than your holding, more patient than your holding has ever been or ever needed to be. Let go. The stone will remain. The names will remain. The sky above the field will remain, moving in its courses, faithful to its order, requiring nothing from the world below it except the willingness to sleep beneath what is already held, already held, already. The 7 names we read tonight, they do not leave. When the voice does, they stay in whatever is carrying them now. You are carrying them. You have been since the first name was spoken. Rest now. You are carrying something 2,300 years old, and it is not heavy. It never was. The field is still. The names remain. Sleep